The gravel road to the old Kincaid place had narrowed in the years since anyone loved it. Knotweed bowed over the ditches, and saplings reached from the fence line like curious hands, testing the empty lane for a pulse. Maren Quell eased her car into the last bend, cut the engine, and let the silence climb in through the windows. Silence had a texture here. It smelled like tin and hay dust and rains that had learned how to pass by without stopping. She sat with both hands on the wheel until her fingers cramped. 15 years had taught her how to survive cities and deadlines and crowded elevators where everyone pretended not to look. Nothing in those years had taught her what to do when the past lifted its head again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The farmhouse roof buckled like a sigh. Paint had peeled from the porch railings in long, curling tongues, exposing gray wood that looked as if it remembered every winter since the county was platted. Beyond it, the barn rose red and stubborn against the sky, the color deepened by weather and time. Her father's barn, built by his own hands, slab by slab, beam by beam, with a patience that had once embarrassed her. Maren unlocked the car, stepped out, and felt the yard answer under her weight. The grass had gone to seed, and the seeds brushed her jeans like whispers. She tugged her jacket tighter and pretended not to see the realtor's flyer trapped under the wiper, curled and damp from the morning's dew. She knew what it said, the developer's offer, the closing date they'd chosen as if the land were already theirs, the words as is doing most of the cruelty. A pickup rolled by on the county blacktop, a mile away. Sound carried over the fields at this hour. She heard the truck rattle like a memory and fade like one, too. No other engines. No other witnesses. Just her and the barn and a question that had iced over in the years since she last drove this lane. What did he leave me? Her father had left the farm when she was 19 and the county was roasting under a July slow burn that turned metal too hot to touch. He'd driven into town to meet a man about a job at the co-op, kissed her hair in a distracted way on his way out, and never returned. The sheriff said he'd skipped, the church ladies said he'd snapped, the bank said its piece in certified letters that piled and then toppled, and Maren, who had once believed every sound a barn made meant a creature trying to get out, learned to stop listening. Now she crossed the yard to the barn because there was no one else left to open it. The farmhouse had surrendered its secrets long ago. The barn had not. She could feel it from here, the way a locked door changes the air around it, compressing time until every step toward it steps back into a different year. The big sliding door still wore his padlock. The brass had gone the green of old coins. At the corner of the frame, her father's carved initials, HJK, squared and deep, were tucked into the join like a signature he didn't expect anyone to notice. Maren thumbed the letters and felt the splinter raised by the K. He'd slipped with the chisel on that last stroke. She'd been 8, watching from the straw pile, mouthing every motion of his hands as if she were the one doing the work. Don't hurry the good parts, he had told her then, and the words came back now, a ghost of sawdust on her tongue. She crouched and opened the galvanized toolbox she'd carried from the car. Bolt cutters. Gloves. A spray of oil for the rollers. She was here to look, not to perform a miracle. Whatever waited inside had been patient for 15 years. It could give her an hour more. The lock gave reluctantly, then all at once, a soft metallic cough. She slid the door a foot. Light slipped in like a careful guest and laid itself across the nearest stall. The smell hit her, hay baked into sweetness by old summers, iron sleeping in its own rust, and something else, something sealed, like paper kept too long in a drawer with apples. She slid the door wider. Shadows withdrew, but not in panic. They retreated like men who know they can step forward again the moment you turn your back. The main aisle was as she remembered and not as she remembered. Her father's order had survived abandonment. Pegs held tools arranged by size rather than use, lengths of chain hung like frozen rivers, the sweep's bristles were combed smooth, as if he'd set it there at the end of a day that never ended. But there were additions, too, a steel cabinet she had never seen at the far wall, a drafting table under the loft, clean and waiting, and, at eye level, a strip of blue painter's tape across a stall door with one word in his crimped block letters, keep. Maren worked her jaw to let the pressure out of her ears. She moved to the stall with the tape and lifted the latch. The door gave an inch. Then stopped. Something inside had been braced against it. She set her shoulder to the wood and pushed. When it finally yielded, it did so with a sucking sound, as if the air inside had grown thick with the years and had to be persuaded to come out. The stall held no hay. It held a tarp, deep green and tight, cinched around a rectangular mass the size of a small car. Its edges were too clean to be farm equipment and too blunt to be anything that belonged in a stall. A hand-painted sign leaned crooked against it, "Do not move." Not yet. Not yet. Maren tasted the words, the caution embedded in them. Not never. Not don't. Not yet. Her father's favorite verb was delay, but only when he meant to win. She crouched and found the block of wood wedged against the base. She slid it away and used both hands to pry the tarp loose from its hooks. The fabric dragged with a noise like distant thunder. Dust rose and hurled itself at the light, and she felt for an instant as if the barn itself were leaving its body, rising in a soft, brown cloud. Under the tarp was a shape made of planes and curves that gathered purpose as they revealed themselves. A hood with louvers, polished to a dull glow. Fenders like draped cloth. A grille composed of thin, vertical bars that made her think of a cathedral gate. She put her palm against it and felt the unexpected chill of metal that had not seen sun in years. "Dad," she heard herself say, not as a summons and not as a curse, but as a key. It was a car, but not a car anyone in the county had owned in her memory. It sat higher than modern coupes, lower than the farm trucks. Its body bore only primer and care. A badge rested on the bench seat as if it had been placed there for later, Packard. Her father had loved Packards the way some men loved saints. She circled it slowly. The tires were new 15 years ago, which meant they were dead now, but even their decay had a tidy look. On the rear quarter, a faint chalk mark read 54 Clip. It meant nothing to her until her mind supplied the rest, 1954 Clipper. Her father's voice in her head, the last of something, each line a small goodbye. Why hide this? Why leave it unfinished? He had never been a man who left a bolt loose. She leaned into the open engine bay and saw the answer wasn't weight but intention. The engine had been rebuilt and then rebuked. It gleamed and yet stood apart, as if it were waiting for permission. Bolted to the firewall, above the distributor, sat a small metal box she had never seen before, a cigar tin-sized object wired with a caution she recognized, the care he'd used when he showed her how not to lose a fingertip to the planer. On its lid, someone had etched numbers, the letter forms careful but shallow, like a prayer carved into hesitant stone. 17.480N/95.203W. Her mind didn't place the coordinates, but her body did something she had not expected. It took a step back and looked for the steel cabinet again. The cabinet had a padlock as well, though smaller, the kind a child might pick to feel brave. She fetched a flathead screwdriver from the pegboard, squeezed it into the shackle's seam, and bent until the steel complained. The lock snapped like a twig too dry to bend. Inside, folders stood in ranks, each with tabs labeled in his tidy hand: Co-op, Fire, Evans, Pruitt, County Board. And a drawer at the bottom with no tab, the paper inside cream and heavy like the good stationery she'd once used to apply for a scholarship and not sent because her father said they didn't need charity if they had two hands and mornings. She drew the bottom drawer. The first sheet was a letter signed with a name she knew too well, Sheriff Todd Latham, his signature sprawled across the page as if it owned the desk that housed it. The letter acknowledged receipt of photocopies of employee safety reports and invoices, thanked her father for his diligence, and asked, in language that reeked of hometown niceness, that he keep all further correspondence between us until we've had a chance to review. Beneath it, clippings: a grain elevator fire 10 counties south, a co-op manager accused of falsifying maintenance logs, an insurance payout that arrived faster than the embers cooled. Her father had triangulated small-town arsons like a man plotting storms. He'd penciled circles around dates, drawn arrows between names that lived on opposite sides of the paper until they met in the margins. Maren closed her eyes and saw him at the kitchen table when she was 14, not with the Packard manual she expected but with a legal pad and a pencil sharpened to sentimental sharpness, drawing lines like fences and erasing them like weather. She set the folder on the drafting table and felt the barn's hush thicken into listening. From the loft, a nervous pigeon clucked, feathers rasping wood. A nail, long ago hammered imperfectly, gleamed at the edge of a sunbeam like a small moon. Her heartbeat counted seconds as if they were a currency she had to spend exactly. 15 years of not opening the barn had been their own kind of strategy. Today, the strategy ended, and strategies that end become stories that begin. She moved through the center aisle, past the stall where a plow waited like a word she couldn't remember. A trapdoor she hadn't seen since she was 10 peered up at her from beneath the hayloft ladder, a square cut so neat it made the rest of the floor look careless. Her father had once told her it led nowhere but dust. She had believed him because his lies were never for himself, they were for her safety and his peace. The iron ring in the trapdoor was cold enough to carry the morning into her skin. She lifted. The hinges held their breath and then released it. A smell rose from the dark, paper and old coffee, the inhuman patience of desiccants in jars. A steep set of wooden steps fell away into a cellar that should not have fit beneath the barn but did because the man who built it was not in the habit of asking permission from geometry. Maren put her foot on the top step and told her stomach to stay where it was. She counted down. 7 steps. A landing. A turn. 5 more. Her eyes adjusted to the low light given by a single bulb stammering in a cage. The hidden room was more office than bunker. Along one wall, a rack of tape recorders sat with their mouths open, as if waiting to testify. Sony, TIAC, names she knew from thrift store aisles and men who loved bands. A reel was threaded through one, a strip of masking tape on its case read, Co-op calls 04/, the last 2 digits smudged into anonymity. On the opposite wall, a pegboard held smaller tools than the ones upstairs, precision screwdrivers, soldering irons, tweezers that could pluck an eyelash from a drum. A radio occupied the end of a workbench, the kind of set hams stacked their Saturdays around. Its face was a galaxy of dials. The power cord traced to a deep cycle battery on the floor. The battery's terminals were capped, the caps hand-lettered with a warning, check water monthly. And in the middle of the room, on a desk scoured smooth by years of impatience, lay a little wooden box with a brass hasp. Maren lifted the hasp and found a key on a chain, a note folded once, and a Polaroid that had burned itself into the paper with the insistence of a memory that refuses to fade. The Polaroid wore the colors of the late 90s. Her father was in it, younger in the way men look young when they're holding things they built, his hand on the fender of a Packard with primer that caught the sun exactly the way the primer upstairs had caught her hand. Beside him stood a woman whose face meant nothing to Maren's speculating mind and everything to her lungs, which forgot for a moment that their job wasn't to ache. The woman held a clipboard, and in the bottom right corner of the frame, a boy's sleeve and shoulder elbowed in, as if he'd been caught both trying to exit and trying to belong. The note said, in her father's careful print, "If you've come this far, it should be you. Do not call Latham. The rest is time and weather. Follow the sound. HJK." Maren's throat tightened at the signature, the way he had always left it, a small carpentered thing at the end of even his most impatient grocery lists. Follow the sound. She could have asked the room what sound, it would have answered by being quiet. She had learned long ago that directions from men like her father were meant to be read with your hands. She turned the radio's main knob. It woke without protest. A soft hiss swam up from its speaker, the ocean of every frequency you don't intend to hear. She adjusted the dial by fractions. The hiss rose and fell and lifted a thread of something, a tone that vibrated her teeth more than her ears. A beacon? The word felt right even if she had no memory to apply it to. She held the Polaroid up beside the radio and felt foolish for the performance until her eye caught on the corner of the photo. There, behind the 3 figures, a roofline sagged into a profile she knew too well, the barn. Not their barn. Another, with a collapsed lean-to and a cupola struck by lightning long enough ago that the scar had weathered into a shrug. She knew that roof the way a child knows the ceiling over her own bed, from hours of looking instead of sleeping. Her father had taught her maps by ditch and hedgerow. On Sunday drives, he'd quizzed her, named the neighbor by the shape of his oaks, named the township line by the behavior of the gravel, named the creek that didn't care about any lines because water's politics are its own. She folded the note and slid it into her pocket, the key and chain around her neck. She climbed the steps back into the barn, set the trapdoor in place, and felt it seal like a closed mouth. Outside, the air had warmed by degrees that would matter to a farmer and not to a meteorologist. The soybean fields beyond the fence line flashed their matte green, and the world smelled briefly of the inside of a tomato. She circled to the back of the barn to scan the horizon. North, the county road stitched itself toward town. South, the creek worked its patient calculus. East, a stand of cottonwoods that had been small enough to need her permission when she was a child now lifted their crowns above the roof peak with adult indifference. West, a wedge of old pasture pitched down toward a dip where runoffs met and sulked. Beyond that dip, on the horizon's second page, a steeple stubbed up the sky like a thorn. She said the names out loud, finding the ones that fit the way a good handle fits a hand. Pruitt Place beyond the creek. Evans Farm to the north, sold to the developer who'd mailed her glossy pictures of cookie-cutter houses that would face east to catch sunrise and HOA dues like taxes you didn't get to vote on. The Miller Barn west, the one the lightning took, the one that had, in some charitable year, smelled like a hive promising honey and now smelled like would rot rehearsing for winter. Follow the sound. It wasn't sound. It was memory on a frequency only her bones could hear. She crossed the yard and took the path she had worn as a child, the one through the windbreak, between the arborvitae that still remembered the shape of her shoulders, and out into the old pasture. A shape rose from the grasses 100 yards away, almost lost in the fields muttering. The cupola at the peak was a square with one eye. The lean-to had collapsed into a pile that looked like a deck of cards punched by a giant knuckle. The lightning scar traced the west face in a crooked seam that ran from roof to foundation, a carpentry lesson taught by anger instead of a teacher. She slowed at the perimeter and listened, not for radio beacons now but for the sounds a living building makes when it's deciding whether it will bear your weight. Wind nested in rafters. A sparrow scolded. Boards creaked at the gentle insult of a field mouse. And beneath all that, so faint she might have blamed a crow's wing, the suggestion of a tone. Not made by birds. Not by wind. Sustained, steady, unmoved by gusts. She pushed the door. It stuck then yielded. Light slashed through dust. The interior had failed politely a long time ago. Stalls slumped. The ladder to the loft had given up and lay in a gentleman's faint across old hay. Across from the door, against the back wall, an electrical panel the size of a suitcase stood bolted into studs that had outlived their purpose. Someone had wired it with a competence that made her think of the radio and the battery and the careful print that had written directions instead of apologies. The tone lived behind the panel. Maren pressed her ear to the metal and heard the steady, insistent heartbeat of something on. She pried the cover. It yielded with a sound like a held breath suddenly released. Inside, a small transmitter, no bigger than a paperback novel, wired to a battery bank in a solar regulator that had been eating sunlight and small, patient meals for years. The transmitter had one button. It was lit. Maren's throat went dry in a way that had nothing to do with dust. She studied the labels her father had scribbled in pencil, their letters softened by humidity. Call, he'd written near the button. Hand, near the battery switch. Town, near a coil of coax that had once fed an antenna through the roof and now dangled like a dry vein. Call what? She whispered. It was the wrong question and the right one. The tone held an answer of its own. I'm already calling. She traced the coax with her fingers to a junction box at the roofline. The cable had not been cut by weather. It had been cut by intention and then peeled away, cleanly, the way her father peeled apples, leaving the skin intact, entire, a springy ribbon he'd lay on her plate like a dare. The tone was still there, steady and indecently calm. She shut off call. The light went out. The tone died. Somewhere in the fields beyond, a crow gave a comment that sounded like approval. A shadow passed the doorway. She froze, breath the wrong size now, lungs either too big to fill or too small to satisfy. Another shadow, then boot steps, not against the barn floor but against the old concrete apron outside. The boot steps were deliberate. Not a kid cutting across the pasture. Not a neighbor without the decency to shout and warn. A truck engine idled somewhere she couldn't see. Maren eased the panel cover back into place and closed it with the sort of care she had once used to slip a book beneath her math homework. She scanned the room for exits that didn't brag about themselves. The lean-to might lead to daylight. The loft might lead to a fall. She stayed by the panel and let her eyes adjust from outside glare until she could see shapes instead of implications. A figure filled the doorway. Tall, hands easy at his sides the way men stand when they want you to believe they've never clenched them. A ball cap with a seed company logo sat low over eyes that had practiced friendliness. His boots were new enough to be a uniform. "Morning," he said, voice as mild as a sales flyer. "Pretty spot you got here. Shame to see it going to waste." Maren didn't move. She could feel the weight of the key on its chain against her sternum. She had forgotten it until now. She swallowed and arranged a face that did not admit fear. "Not mine," she said. "Belonged to a friend." "That so?" He stepped inside and made the place smaller by a foot in every direction. "Funny. Records say it belonged to Harlan Kincaid." "That's your father, isn't it?" He didn't make it a question because questions require a pause that can be used to think. He kept moving, eyes inventorying the room with an interest he tried and failed to keep impersonal. Maren said nothing. He nodded as if she'd confirmed something anyway. "County records also say there's a lane. Been there a while." He ran a gloved finger along the edge of the electrical panel as if he were checking for dust and the dust had wronged him. "We represent parties who are motivated to close out old business. And to help folks move forward." "By buying their past?" she asked, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "By taking it off their hands," he said, the smile he offered like a business card he didn't expect her to read. "You can't live in it. You can't eat it. Best to turn it into something that pays." She could feel the transmitter behind the panel like a heartbeat against her palm, even though it was off. She heard, in a way that was more fact than sound, the tone it had been sending a minute ago into a world she didn't understand, the world where men listened to air and spoke to distance. The man wasn't alone. A second shape moved behind him, then stepped into the doorway, then leaned against it in a way that said he'd been told to block and took pride in obeying. "You can tell your parties," Maren said, swallowing once to make room for the words, "they can send their offers through my attorney." He laughed, not at the word attorney but at her using it. "Of course," he said, the cordiality a little heavier now, like syrup whose bottle had been left open overnight. "I'll pass that along." He stepped closer to the panel again. "Curious old rig." "It's junk," she lied, because some lies are the only decent way to keep a truth upright long enough to use it. He liked tinkering. Didn't like finishing. That landed. He carried the information back to the truck with his eyes. "Don't spend too long out here," he said. "Storm brewing tonight. You know how these roofs are." He left without turning his back on her. The other man went first, then him, then the truck's engine note moved away, lost its interest, and became sound for someone else's day. Maren let the breath out of her body and found that it had in fact survived. She counted her hands, then her feet, then the number of times the radio had bruised her thumb when she lifted it. She turned the transmitter back on and watched the light return. The tone followed a second later, as if it needed to remember itself each time. "Follow the sound." She returned to the Kincaid barn with her mind moving at a speed her legs hated. The Packard sat with the patient vanity of all unfinished beauties. The steel cabinet waited for a set of eyes with time. The trapdoor looked like any other floor until you tugged at it and heard it admit its better truth. She descended again, radio now cradled like a petulant child that needed to be carried even when it knew how to walk. The note in her pocket felt as if it had warmed by taking on the temperature of her intent. On the bench, beside the radio, a map she had missed earlier lay folded once, then again. She opened it. It wasn't a road map. It was her father's kind, topographic, county scale, the kind farmers and men who refuse to ask for directions prefer because it shows the world as a set of arguments between elevations and drainages, not a sequence of brand name opportunities. He had marked it with a red pencil. A straight line traced from their barn to the Miller place, then kinked through the old fence gap to a creek crossing, then followed a hedgerow like a rumor. At the end of the line, he'd drawn a circle and written 3 letters that meant nothing to her until she said them out loud and heard how they worked in a mouth. AER. Air. Air. Or something that wanted to be air but couldn't spell itself without help. She lifted the reel from the tape recorder and slid it into place with a care that would have made her father nod if he'd chosen to be generous that day. She pressed play. The machine shuddered and then remembered how to do its job. The room filled with the static of long distance and then a voice, male, older than she was now but younger than she remembered in her father, slight accent from nowhere specific, that general American flattening that makes every question sound safe until you answer it. Copy that, Harlan. Same coordinates, same time frame. You're sure? A pause. And then her father's voice, younger than the last time she heard it, older than the first time she trusted it. Always sure enough to test. Not sure enough to quit. God help you for a stubborn man. God helps the ones who build their own ladders, her father said quietly. We'll be on at noon. If I don't call, tell her. The tape sputtered into static, then came back, then fractured again into a shredding sound that meant the past had ended in the middle of a sentence and preferred to stay that way. Maren stood with her fingers on the reels as if she could flatten the tape and iron the years out of its wrinkles. Noon. A voice. A plan. A stubbornness that made men build transmitters and teach their daughters to count fences in the rain. She set the radio on the desk and watched its needle quiver as she turned the dial to the place where the tone lived. A new sound braided itself into the hiss. Not a voice. A pattern. 3 short beeps, a long, a short. Then silence. Then again. She didn't know code but she knew insistence, and this was insistence with a metronome. She checked her phone. No service, of course. This county saved its signals for harvest and elections. She breathed and made a promise to the room that she might or might not be able to keep. At noon, she'd answer. Upstairs, she ate an apple she found improbably unspoiled inside the farmhouse fridge because she suddenly needed the chore of chewing. She filled a thermos with water. She packed the Polaroid and the note and the key in a small, mean hammer she'd loved since she was 8 because it fit her hand without asking permission. At 11:58, she went back down. The radio's needle trembled as if it had been doing calisthenics in her absence and was now pretending to be calm. She tuned until the tone was a thread she could wrap around. The pattern arrived. 3 short. 1 long. 1 short. Noon made its soundless step into the room. Maren pressed transmit on the microphone with a thumb that was entirely not prepared to be history. This is, she stopped because she had no call sign and because names did things to conversations they couldn't do to this one. I hear you, she said instead, and felt how her voice carried differently when a machine was helping it. Silence. Then the briefest crackle. Then a voice that had built itself out of years of travel through copper and air in some stubborn tunnel only the lonely know how to dig. Say again, the voice said. Who is this? She swallowed. I hear you, she repeated, because repeating what works is how barns stand longer than anyone expects them to. She almost said this is Maren, then didn't, then did, to prove something to herself, if not to the static. This is Maren. A pause. 1 beat. 2. Enough for her to hear her own heart and the memory it made. Then, Maren? The voice said her name like a man stepping onto a floor that might not bear him. It wasn't old in the way of the very aged. It was old in the way of men who have not said certain words in a long time because they trusted silence to do work words couldn't. Yes, she said, and her mouth felt suddenly full of apples and sawdust and afternoons she didn't realize she still owned. "Who am I talking to?" Static breathed. A far-off rumble that could have been a thunderhead waking on the horizon leaned into the signal and then fell away. The voice returned. "If you're Marin," it said, calm in a way that made the hairs on her arms change their plans, "then you already have the key." Her hand went to the chain at her throat. The brass touched her skin like a coin that doesn't know who'll spend it. "I do," she said. "Then you know where to use it." "I don't." The honesty surprised her. It surprised the room. It did not, apparently, surprise the voice. "You will," he said. "Because I taught you how to listen." Marin leaned against the bench to spare the room the indignity of having to catch her if her knees changed their mind about standing. "Who is this?" she asked, softer now, not because she feared the answer but because some answers are like birds and have to be invited in without clapping. The radio clicked. The kind of click that means a hand has found a button by muscle memory and not by thought. The voice that came was careful the way her father's pencil had been when he wrote letters he knew might leave the house. "Don't trust the sheriff," he said. "Don't tell the bank. And when you walk into the stall marked Keep, look for the second floor." "There is no second floor," she said, before her better self could stop her mouth. "I've been in that stall since I—" A sound rose from the speaker that was not a laugh and not a sob and not an apology. It was something that happens in a man's throat when he discovers either that miracles keep a timetable or that he does. "You've never looked up," the voice said gently. "Not there." The radio went dead. Marin stood with the microphone cooling in her hand and the silence warming the room by degrees that had nothing to do with weather. The barn above her creaked in a way she had once interpreted as a lullaby. She set the microphone down and climbed. Upstairs, the Keep stall was as she left it, tarp folded, dust turned into light by the day's intrusions, Packard patient as a mule told to hold a plow in a field that had not yet learned the word harvest. She slipped into the stall, set her palms against the smooth primer, and then, obeying a voice she did not know how to name and did not need to, she looked up. The first thing she saw was not what she was meant to. She saw rafters and the undersides of shingles and the places where daylight makes a confession of every nail hole. Then she saw it, the line of cutwood running across the bay where there should have been nothing but joists and air. A shallow platform. No thicker than her hand. Painted the same color as the joists, dusted to the same tone, designed to be a secret by simply not being more interesting than its surroundings. Her pulse discovered its job again. She felt along the post for a seam and found, 3 feet up, a counterweight latch polished by a hand that had used it 1,000 times and never told anyone it existed. She pressed. The platform sighed down an inch and then stayed where it was, as if asking whether she wanted to do more than inspect. She dragged a shop stool into the stall and climbed until her shoulder met the platform's edge. The gap it revealed was dark and tight and smelled of oil and paper and the kind of coffee that men drink at 2 in the morning and call good because they have something better to do than be honest. She slid her arm inside to feel for a switch. Her fingers brushed the spine of a binder instead. Another inch found a cord. She pulled. A small bulb lit with the tired decency of a cousin candle. The second floor was less a floor than a shelf wide enough to hold a secret and long enough to hold 15 years. Binders. Ledger books. Cassettes labeled with dates and first names. A cigar tin that, when she flipped it open, held a neat stack of SIM cards. A photo, clipped from a newsletter, of Sheriff Todd Latham in a suit he didn't like, shaking hands with a man whose smile knew numbers. At the far end, close to the wall, a metal case the size of a lunchbox sat with its latch set and its hinge tested and its posture saying, "I have traveled and I do not like to be jostled." She pulled it toward her with the care of someone moving a sleeping animal. She opened it. Inside lay a passport with a photo of a man who looked a little like her father and a lot like a man trying to look like someone else. Under it lay a wad of bills and denominations that didn't apologize. Beside it, wrapped in waxed paper like a sandwich that would never be eaten, a revolver wiped of fingerprints before being oiled to a shine that demanded to be touched and refused to be friendly about it. The binder nearest her had a name on its spine, Evans. She opened it to the first page and found receipts, not photocopies but originals, the kind men keep when they have learned not to trust copies. Signatures. Dates. The arithmetic that turns a barn into a ledger and a ledger into a blade. Outside, a truck engine idled again, closer this time. The thin glass of the barn window showed her a slice of the lane where the knotweed leaned. 2 trucks, not one. Both white. Both wearing the cautious blank faces of company vehicles that like to be thought of as innocent. Maren slid the binder back where it had been. She returned the case to its position, closed the light, and let the platform accept the weight of her decision. It rose with a murmur and clicked back into its habit of being invisible. The barn door slid a foot and then another. Boots. Always boots. The air changed shape around the sound. She set her palm on the Packard's hood because she needed to touch something that felt like a promise. A voice she did not know called into the barn as if he were entering a neighbor's kitchen without knocking. "Ms. Quell?" She kept her back to the door and felt the space grow an inch smaller for each syllable that followed. "This is Sheriff Latham. Thought I might find you out here." Her father's note pressed against her hip like a warning that had changed its mind about being polite. Maren turned, slow enough to own it, fast enough to decline the offer to be afraid. The sheriff's uniform did not improve the man who wore it. His eyes studied the Packard, then the stall, then the dust she had disturbed in the places a deputy would not think to look. "Lot of history in a place like this," he said. "Not a question." "Depends what you call history," she replied. "Some folks just call it age." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that would have gotten him voted class treasurer if he'd known a different set of parents. "I'll be straight with you," he said. "The county's interested in a clean transition here. There's liability. Folks come into old structures and get hurt. We'd hate to see that." "I'll take my chances," she said. "That's what we're worried about," he said, and this time when he smiled, the treasurer ran for sheriff and won. "Maybe we can get you to sign something, absolve the county. Or better, let us help you get this place wrapped up." He drifted farther into the barn. His deputy, younger than the boot polish he wore, hovered at the door pretending to be a hinge. The sheriff's hand grazed the stall latch. He did not look down when he touched it. He was looking at her the whole time. "Thing about history," he went on, "is that it shows up when you're least ready to entertain it. Best to invite it in on your terms." Maren stepped so that the stall door stood between them. It was not a barricade and not a conversation piece. It was a line. "What terms are those?" she asked. "Let us do a walkthrough," he said. "Just the barn and the house. Make sure there's nothing unsafe. Nothing the county has to babysit if something goes wrong." "No," she said. "I'll let you know if I need help." Something in his gaze cooled, then warmed, then settled into the temperature used for reconsidering. "You know, your father and I," he began. "Wrote each other letters," she finished, because he had given her that much in his paperwork and because she wanted to see if saying it would make his mouth change shape. It did. Slightly. "Enough." The sheriff's smile thinned. "I always liked Harlan," he said. "Hard-headed, sure, but decent. Shame how things ended." Ended, the word hung there and then landed where words land when they're meant to end arguments by suggesting there is nothing left to argue about. The deputy cleared his throat in the doorway. "Storm's building, Sheriff." The sheriff looked past Maren toward the Packard and then at the loft ladders and then at the joists and then at the stall where some men keep secrets. "Wrap it quick," he said, and the deputy disappeared into the weather smell. "I'll be back by evening," Latham told her. "Just to make sure you got out safe before the rain finds what it wants to loosen." He left. The barn inhaled. Maren let the breath she'd been saving slide out of her lungs like something she had stolen and was returning because guilt weighs more than air. She locked the barn door behind them, though locks mean little to men who believe their jobs include the right to open what they like. She returned to the stall and pressed the latch for the platform again. The little light came up like a morale officer. "Follow the sound. Follow the map. Follow the part of you that got you grounded at 16 for driving the tractor into town to buy screws because you said if you waited for a ride the shed door would fall and the bull would get out and then everyone would be sorry. She pulled the binders nearest to hand, Co-op and County Board, and laid them out on the Packard's hood the way he would have, no coffee rings, pens squared. Papers told stories in their own grammar, dates introduced themselves, signatures flirted with liability, amounts whispered motives. Her father had collected complaint after complaint about the Co-op's grain dryer, about the pressure relief valve that stuck at the worst times, about the way certain shipments weighed more before the fire than after. He had totaled insurance payouts across 3 counties and then circled the names of the adjusters who wrote the checks and the men who cashed them. He had drawn a box around Pruitt twice, and next to it, in his neatest print, a word that meant the opposite of what he'd taught her about the order of things: ignition. The rain began its early rehearsal on the roof like fingers testing a piano. Maren closed the binders and slid them back onto the platform. She took only the small case, the Polaroid, the key now warm against her skin, and the map. The radio she left where it could hear the rain. Noon had come and gone. The next voice would be at a time of the voice's choosing. She stepped into the yard with the first real drops and felt the kind of cold that isn't just a temperature but a premise. The lane ran between fields that had grown opinionated about drainage. The cottonwoods to the east wrote their long cursive across the sky. The Miller barn's roofline hunched into view by the time she reached the old fence gap. The transmitter's lead I watched from behind its metal face the way a kestrel watches the ditch for what runs when it shouldn't. Maren took the map's line as if it were a hand held out by someone she'd once danced with and had not forgiven. The creek crossed the field in its old mood, convinced of its right to be where it was and nobody else's. She stepped on the flat stones her father had pretended not to lay. On the far bank, the hedgerow guarded a swale that had spent a decade learning how to be a secret. The red circle on the map sat not on a building but on a notch between 2 elms. Maren counted her paces as if she were stitching a scene with her feet. At the notch, brush had sprung up so enthusiastically it had become its own argument. She used the mean hammer to persuade it otherwise. Behind the brush, buried to its rim and covered with a slew of leaf mold, a metal hatch lay like a coin in the ground. A keypad grinned up at her through dirt. 4 digits. A cover that had once kept rain out now let spiders in. The label on the hinge had a brand name that meant nothing to anyone but men who sold peace of mind out of catalogs. She held the key on its chain in her palm and felt the weight it chose. The Polaroid sat warm in her pocket, its edges softened by travel. The numbers on the engine bay box moved through her head, 17.480 and 95.203. 4 digits. Or 2 pairs of 2. Or a habit of a man who loved coordinates and built rooms where none should fit. She typed 1748. The keypad chirped its refusal with such politeness she hated it. She tried 9520. Another chirp. The rain picked up the way a conversation turns when the wrong word has been chosen and the right one must be courted. She stopped thinking like a map and started thinking like a man who filed everything under the same few instincts. HJK. She typed 1907, the year her grandfather had carved into the farmhouse stair, the year her father had pointed to she didn't know how many times when he needed a story to slow her down. The keypad lit green. The latch thunked. The hatch lifted with the weight of a story that had been polite too long. Cold air rose from below in a ribbon that tasted of stone and choices. A metal ladder descended into a cylinder lined in poured concrete. Lights flicked on in sequence when she took the 3rd rung, then the 5th, then the 7th, as if counting were a ritual no longer optional. At the bottom, a door waited with a handle that had never been forced. She set her palm against it and felt, through steel, the steady tremor of machinery doing work for which it could not be thanked. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was not large. It was not small. It was exactly the size of everything she had not known she was missing. Along one wall, shelves groaned under the weight of binders in the same hand she'd just touched upstairs. Along another, a table held a set of blueprints under glass and a coffee cup that had been washed well before it was set there to wait. On the far side, a narrow cot wore a folded blanket with no dust on it. In the center, bolts anchored a cylinder to the floor. The cylinder had hoses, gauges, a window the size of a paperback book. Marin took one step, then another. The rain above found a new instrument to play on the hatch and tried it out. The gauge needles sat steady in their lined seats. The window showed only her reflection and the scream her face had decided not to voice. She set her palm against the glass and felt nothing because that's how glass answers every question. Behind her, a sound rose at the ladder. A footfall. Careful. Another. A voice. Not in the room yet. Coming down because it had a right to. Marin, it called, not loudly, but with a certainty that made her name into a lever. Her throat remembered how to be dry. Her fingers forgot the polite ways to uncurl. The last footfall reached the floor. The door eased open. A man stepped into the room and into the life she had built by walking in the other direction. "Kiddo," he said, and the word destroyed 15 years of weather in a syllable. He lifted his hand to take off a cap that wasn't there and then let it fall because habits die slower than men. She turned, breathless because breathing had become something she now had to remember on purpose. Harlan J. Kincaid stood in the doorway, older at the edges and exact in the eyes, a man who had never learned to be anything but himself and was learning again now as if the lesson finally suited him. "I told you not to call the sheriff," he said, apologizing with his mouth and taking credit with his posture. Lightning cracked somewhere above them, in the room's one light flickered, recovered, and insisted on burning. Marin opened her mouth to answer and found the floor tilt beneath a question she had not yet formed. There was something moving in the cylinder. A shadow. A shift. A breath where no breath should be. The window fogged, just for a moment, from the inside. The gauge needle crept a hair's width left. Harlan's eyes cut to the cylinder, and all the color in his face left for the roof. "Don't touch that," he said, and the word that grew teeth as it crossed the room. The cylinder's latch twitched. Something inside it knocked, once, gently, like a guest with manners. Marin took a step she couldn't name and set her palm against the glass one more time because the second time you touch a thing is when you admit the first time meant it. On the other side of the window, a hand rose to meet hers. The door at the top of the ladder banged open against weather and intent. Boots pounded rungs. Sheriff Latham shouted, "Ms. Quell." In the humming half-light, the cylinder's hatch began to turn. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The cylinder's hatch began to turn. Marin didn't breathe because breath would make noise and noise would be heard, and once noise is heard it has to be answered. The wheel on the hatch rotated another quarter and paused, as if listening for permission. Somewhere above, rain drummed on the hatch at the top of the ladder. Somewhere below, a pump hummed with the stubborn optimism of machines that believe work is its own reward. "Don't," Harlan repeated, voice low, hand out, palm open in the universal language of stop. He didn't move toward her, he knew better than to crowd her now. He moved toward the panel on the wall and flipped a switch she hadn't seen. The pump's hum softened to a purr. Gauges quivered, needles settling into the narrow green that separates safety from regret. Boots clanged on the ladder above them. One rung. Two. Each impact sent a metallic little verdict down the cylinder of the shaft. Latham's voice pinballed in the concrete. "Ms. Quell." Not a question now, possession disguised as concern. Marin kept her palm pressed to the window. Inside, another palm matched it through the glass, small, elegant, calloused along the thumb in a way that said the hand had learned both pens and wrenches. She didn't look at Harlan because looking at him would make this moment about him and not the fact that a stranger's breath was fogging the glass at the exact places hers had a second ago. Click. A second switch. The hatch's wheel stilled. Harlan stepped in beside her, careful to keep his shoulder half a foot from hers, the distance a man uses when he knows the person beside him is bracing on air. "Pressure equalized," he said softly. "Give it one more minute." "And then?" she asked, hearing how the word tried to tremble and choosing to let it tremble because strength that pretends is a kind of weakness she didn't have time for anymore. And then we let her out, he said. Her boots. Clang. The rhythm climbed from warning to inevitability. The storm shoved its wet shoulder harder against the world up there, as if it had also been invited and refused to wait. Who? Marin asked, because names do to reality what a match does to a wick. Someone I chose to keep safe the day I disappeared, Harlan said. Someone the sheriff would prefer had burned. He reached for the hatch wheel and placed his thick fingers on the spokes. Marin looked at the door to the shaft because some part of her had become responsible for doors now. The handle was latched. The deadbolt was thrown. The metal was what metal is, loyal only to the hand that turns it. On the other side of that door, a badge was descending with a pistol and a story he meant to make true by repetition. Harlan turned the wheel. It gave with the satisfaction of something finally being asked to do the thing it was built for. Cold air unfurled from the seam. The door swung on its hinge in a slow arc, clearing the cylinder's face. Inside, no smoke, no preserved horror, no chemical fog, only a woman stepping forward with the stiffness of anyone who's been asked to wait too long. She braced a hand against the frame and blinked as if the room was a bright question. Tall, mid-40s maybe, but with the kind of age that comes from insisting on purpose every morning. Dark hair cut to function and not fashion. Eyes that had learned to catalog exits before names. Marin, Harlan said, and for the first time since he'd said kiddo his voice betrayed him. This is Nor. Nor. A syllable that meant light in several languages and here meant heat and history and the shadow of flame. Nor's eyes found Marin's like a compass needle that had been taken away from true north and just given it back. Hello, she said, voice dry from air that had been filtered and counted. You have his hands. The latter sang again, closer, louder, the song of metal that knows it's about to be an accomplice. Marin took a half step between Nor and the shaft door. He left, she heard herself tell Nor, and realized she was saying it to both of them. He left and didn't call on the bank and the letters and the church ladies. And the sheriff, Nor finished calmly. Who always smiles when he says you have nothing to worry about. Ms. Quell. Rungs. One after the other. A second voice under Latham's now, young, clipped, too sure. The deputy, dragging his courage down the ladder by the badge. Harlan's hand was on the second panel now, a stout metal cabinet in the corner with an antenna feed like a vein. He flipped a breaker. The cabinet's face lit in a patient sequence. On a small screen, a wave bar waited for a command. I didn't call because every call would have been a direction arrow for the men I was trying to stay ahead of, he said, not apologizing, not excusing, just setting boards between posts to make a fence sturdy enough to talk across. This, he nodded toward Nor, was the only way to keep you out of it and her alive. Alive for what? Marin asked. To testify, Nor answered simply. And to make it to the other side of a very old, very local fire. The door handle rattled. The deadbolt thudded once in its seat. Ms. Quell, Latham said through steel. Friendly still, and friendlier for being muffled. We'll need you to open the door. Storm's serious. You could get trapped down there. You've got a warrant? Marin called back, shocking herself with how even she could make a voice in a room like this sound. She had learned that in the city, the power of asking a question the other person knows he should have prepared for and didn't. A beat. Then, we can talk about paperwork when this weather calms. Harlan's mouth moved toward a grin and changed its mind. He flicked another switch. The cabinet's speaker crackled. The transmitter in the Miller barn hummed a harmonic in answer. Somewhere far, then near, the old radio upstairs woke like a dog hearing the car in the lane. Marin, Nor said. Listen to me. That voice, composed without being cold, had the authority of someone accustomed to being in rooms where men introduced themselves to each other and forgot to introduce her. A year before your father left, the co-op had an accident. A dryer fire that left half the bins scorched and 3 workers burned badly enough to become a cautionary tale. They called it faulty equipment. It wasn't. It was staged, and insured, and paid out, and the men who did it had help drawing the map. The names in his binders, Marin said. Pruitt. Evans. Adjusters with short memories. Latham. She felt the note in her pocket like live wire. Do not call Latham. Open. The door, Latham said, the neighborly varnish thinner now. The deputy thumped the bowl with what sounded like a baton. We're counting to 3. Nor looked at the cylinder, at the cot, at the shelves. You hit the beacon, she said to Harlan. It wasn't a question. Good. She laid 2 fingers against the inside of the crook of her elbow, counting her pulse. Then they're listening. Who's they? Marin asked, still between the door and Nor, positioning her own body in a way she did not interrogate yet because later is for interrogations and now is for decisions. Everybody who can make a badge behave when it forgets what it's for, Nor said. And everybody who knows this county's tragedies have a habit of being profitable for the same men. 1, Latham said, and the number didn't break like a man counting for safety. It cracked like a threat folding its sleeves. 2. Harlan undid the deadbolt and met Marin's eyes. Stand behind me, he said gently. And if I say, pull the red lever on the cabinet and keep it down until I tell you to stop. What does it do? She asked. Turns the listening into recording into broadcasting, he said. Turns here into everywhere. 3, Latham said, and the battering changed from baton to boot. The door jumped in its frame. Harlan twisted the handle and let the door swing a hand's width. Latham's face bloomed in the gap, rain slick, eyes bright with the kind of certainty men examine only after retirement. He had the look of a man who expected a kitchen and a pot of coffee and a woman apologizing for the mess. He found a room, and 3 people who had decided they weren't furniture. We had reports, he said, pleasant. Concerned citizens. Strange activity. We want to make sure you're safe. His gaze slid over Harlan and stuck to Nor with the terrible adhesion of recognition. For a breath, he lost his sentence. The deputy behind him leaned to see. What is this? Latham asked, and though his voice kept trying to be casual, his trigger finger heroically failed to get the message. It twitched. A storm shelter, Marin said flatly. You said there was a storm. Step aside, Ms. Quell, Latham said. We'll need to inspect. No, she said. Behind her, Nor said, Sheriff, you remember me. Her tone balanced on an edge that was not apology and not accusation. I remember you. I remember the day your office lost the tape of my call about the dryer's pressure valve. I remember how the investigation ended with a ribbon cutting for the rebuild financed by an insurance check your brother-in-law's firm expedited. You remember? The deputy's weight shifted. Latham kept his face a map of roads that always lead where he wants them to. Ma'am, you were mistaken then and you're mistaken now. Those were difficult days. People misremember under stress. Not this, Nor said. Not the smell of hot grain and burned paint. Not the way the compressor kicked twice before it screamed. Not the sound the manager made when he realized we'd seen the siphon on the tank. Marin looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the cabinet. Marin's hand found the red lever and hovered. Sheriff, Harlan said, nearly polite. We're going to resolve this like neighbors. You're going to step back 3 paces. You're going to keep your weapon holstered. And you're going to listen. Or? Latham asked, smiling with only his teeth. Or the county that votes you in every year will hear what you just said, Harlan replied. No heat, no raise in voice, just information. And they will hear it in your voice. On whose station? Latham scoffed. That rusty old radio in the barn? Harlan nodded toward Nor. Nor nodded toward Marin. Now, Nor said. Marin pulled the red lever. The cabinet went from purr to purpose. Somewhere above them, the little transmitter in the Miller barn sang. The old radio in the Kincaid barn caught the note and turned it into a current that wandered the county the way gossip does when the doors are open and the windows are high. The wave bar filled with the first rectangles of a story choosing a frequency. Say hello, Sheriff, Nor said. Calm as a metronome. You were counting. Latham's eyes measured the room again, this time looking for cameras as much as threats. He kept his voice even. "Ms. Quell, you are interfering with law enforcement. I need you to stop." "You have a warrant?" Marin asked again. "I don't need one to check on a citizen's welfare," he said. "You do to come into her storm shelter," Noor said, and Marin heard the lawyer in the bones of the words even if Noor hadn't sworn the oath. "You do to seize property. You do to stop us from making sure the county hears the one thing you can't afford for them to hear." "What's that?" Latham asked, aiming for mockery and landing on dread. "That you've been torching the past to buy a future you can sell to your friends," Noor said. The deputy shifted again. "Sheriff," he said, and in the one word Marin heard a boy who'd only ever seen corruption on television and thought himself immune to it when it walked in with his boss. "I'm done," Latham said to Noor. "I don't know who you are, but I know who she is and I know who he is, and I know that if there's one thing this county doesn't need, it's a washed-up mechanic who couldn't pay his notes and a runaway co-op temp telling stories in a basement." He pushed the door with his palm. Harlan let it move just enough to make Latham think he'd won and then stopped it. Concrete framed steel, and steel did what steel does when someone trusts it to. It held. "Record this part too," Noor said to the cabinet, and Marin realized she didn't have to say it to the machine. Saying it to the room made the machine behave better anyway. "You can turn it off," Latham said to Marin, setting his mouth in a straight line men mistake for authority. "You can do the smart thing. Think of your future. Think of what happens if you pick a fight with your county." "My county?" Marin said, and the words came out surprising even her. "You mean the county my father kept whole while you bought off its broken pieces?" She felt her heart find a gear it hadn't used since she was 16 and drove a tractor into town to buy screws. "You mean the county where families kept coffee cans full of bolts under their sinks because the store closed after the fire and you told them to be grateful it wasn't worse?" She took a step toward the door. The red lever buzzed under her hand like a hound on point. "I'm thinking about it." Above them, thunder muttered sentences. Then, like an old man deciding whether to sit or stand, the storm committed to sitting. Rain thickened. The ladder trembled with the weight of more boots, 2, 3. Men loyal to a paycheck and the smell of wet duty. "Upstairs," Harlan said under his breath. "We need more time than we can buy down here." "Upstairs where?" Marin asked. He pointed at the blueprint under glass on the table, a drawing of the barn, the hidden room, the line of conduit that ran beneath the yard and came up under the Packard stall. A dotted line showed a second exit. "Back of the feed room," he said. "Loose panel. Takes you up behind the tool wall." "Go," Noor said. She moved to the cylinder, flipped 2 levers, and killed the machine's hungry hum. "I'll hold the sheriff's attention." "I'm not leaving you," Marin said. "Not leaving me," Noor corrected, gentle and firm all at once. "Moving the story forward. That's different." She looked at Harlan. 2 minutes. He nodded. 2. He turned to Marin. "On me." They moved. Marin fixed the knob in her mind, the way it felt, the weight of the door, the way the deadbolt sat like a thumb held against a pulse. She let the room and Noor in the cylinder in the cabinet become a single point she could find later blindfolded. Then she followed Harlan through a narrow notch behind the shelves and into a corridor that felt like a thought her father had once had and forgotten to tell anyone. At the end, a panel of plywood waited. Harlan worked a dull knife into a seam and pried until the wood leaned. Wet air crowded the gap like a neighbor. They wriggled through and stood, after a low crawl, behind the pegboard in the barn's tool wall. Marin could see the neat silhouettes of wrenches and chisels backlit by the storm's trickle of light. Harlan pressed a finger to his lips and slid a peg out. A rectangle of toolboard hinged like a book. They stepped into the feed room. Lightning mapped the loft in a single impatient stroke. The Packard squatted like a secret, trying very hard not to be elegant while it waited. Rain beat the roof in a cadence that wanted to be counted. 2 minutes, Marin whispered. "Then what?" "Then we open the rest," Harlan said. "We take the binders, the tapes, the SIM cards. We plug them into the world so fast no one can pull them out without looking like they hate daylight. And the sheriff, she asked. Will be busy explaining his jurisdiction to people who don't care, Harlan said. If we keep nor talking. He moved to the keep stall. Give me your hands. They worked the platform latch together. It slid down. Binders. Ledgers. The metal lunchbox case. Harlan took 2 and laid them on the Packard's hood. Marin took 3 and felt the weight translate between her palms and her future. When she reached for the cigar tin of SIM cards, thunder landed so close it rearranged the barn's bones. And with the thunder came headlights, several, splashing across the far wall through the old windows. Trucks. Not white this time. Dark and dull and official in their unofficial way. You've stirred the nest, Harlan said. Good. But his mouth was tight. A voice amplified by a loud hailer rolled across the yard, sheriff's office. Anybody inside, come out with hands visible. They brought the county, Marin said. They brought the men who owe the county favors, Harlan corrected. He shoved the metal case into her arms. Feed room door, he said. There's a trough outside. Stay low. The cottonwoods will break the sight line. Crawl to the windbreak. The ditch will carry you to the creek. If they come in, they'll come loud. They always do when they think loud is a substitute for right. You want me to run? She asked. I want you to move, he said, and in the words she could hear everything he had not said in 15 years. I'll be a step behind. Gunmetal thunder underlaid the next flash. The barn's big doors rattled in their track, then slid a foot from outside. A face appeared. Not Latham's. Another, fatter in confidence if thinner in ethics. Harlan made a decision Marin could feel without seeing. He grabbed the shotgun case from under the tool bench, popped it, tossed the gun to her, and said, never at a person. At a latch. At a tire. At a future that doesn't deserve to open. Her hands remembered heft from clay pigeons and an aunt who taught her to shoot at cans and to never, ever mistake noise for skill. She cracked the action, checked the shells, closed it, and felt the old American impulse to be a problem bang against the new American resolve to be a solution. The barn doors yawned another foot. Wind punched wet into the aisle. A man with a badge on his belt but not his chest stepped over the threshold, muzzle first. County inspection, he called. Step forward and identify. Inspections in the morning, Harlan said from the shadow of the tack room. Come back with a clipboard. The man laughed. 2 more stepped in behind him. Their boots sucked audibly at the mud under the awning, the sound of men committed to entering not because they were mandated to but because they were invited by their own nerve. Marin slid into the feed room's back doorway, crouched, and angled the gun at the lower hinge of the barn door. The first man was halfway down the aisle. Harlan put his palm on the Packard's hood, 3 beats, and then lifted it. A count. Marin fired. The hinge screamed as it went, metal listing forward into a skew the door did not appreciate. The first man jerked around toward the sound. The second flinched. The third swore. Harlan hit the floodlight switch and killed it. Darkness swallowed the aisle. Lightning stitched it back. In the confusion, Marin dropped and rolled out the feed room door into the trough and into the cold close wet of a world that didn't care who you were as long as you were quick. Muddy water shot into her boots and then decided it liked living there. She scuttled along the trough's muddy lip to the cottonwoods. The windbreak took her in with the grace of a choir that has always had room for one more alto. Behind her, the barn filled with voices and a kind of thunder that wasn't weather. Down, someone shouted. Then a sound like a shovel hitting a sheet of tin as a table went over. She belly crawled to the fence gap and then took the ditch like a soldier who had read about war and hoped to live long enough to write a correction. The ditch kinked west. The creek waited. The map in her head unfolded itself and pointed a finger. She reached the cottonwoods. A limb shivered. A hawk snapped a warning and then forgave her trespass for the common cause of going on living. At the creek, she hesitated, water black glass under lightning, and then stepped into it because there are only two kinds of pauses, the ones that let a better plan into the room, and the ones that let fear occupy the chair. This was not one of the better planned ones. Cold slapped her thighs. The metal case bumped her ribs. She kept it to her side so that if she fell it would remain dry or, if not dry, at least salvageable. On the far bank, someone grabbed her wrist. She struck, reflex, the muzzle swinging up, and stopped in time because Harlan's whisper and the smell of coffee on a work shirt woke something old in her that said, "Not him." "Good," he said, not exactly smiling because there wasn't time, but approving the way a man approves a fence post that's level on the first try. "Back way. We'll circle the Miller place and come in behind the trucks." "Where's Nor?" Marin asked. "Talking," he said. "Buying us a third minute." He tugged her up the bank. And painting the sheriff into a smaller and smaller room. They moved under cottonwoods written full of rain. The wind threw handfuls of water from leaves and called it blessing. In the ditch, frogs made bargains with each other over the noise. They came up behind the Miller barn and its faithful transmitter's dull, enthusiastic glow. The panels lit, winked at them like a conspirator. "Backup antenna," Harlan said, and pointed to a second coax that ran from the panel up into the rafters. "If they find the first, they won't find the second until someone with a better diagram comes." He knelt, popped a junction, slid a connector, checked a weather boot. "Now the world hears from here, too." "Who is the world?" Marin asked again. "County scanner nuts. Old hams. The kind of teenagers who set alerts for anything that sounds like trouble. A woman at the paper who doesn't have a raise but does have a conscience. A station in the next county over that loves nothing more than a scandal they didn't have to pay a stringer to find," Harlan said. "Enough ears to be a crowd." They crouch ran along the hedgerow toward the lane. The trucks were idling out front of the Kincaid barn now, stippling the stone with diesel. Men stood with arms crossed under slickers, watching doors that didn't open in a house that refused to apologize for having no lights on. Harlan led her to the culvert under the lane and into it with the ease of a man who built it and had pictured this exact moment a dozen times the winter it went in. They warmed beneath the road with the roar of tires close enough to be somebody's bad idea of a lullaby. On the far side, in the ditch, they paused and listened. The loud hailer again, last warning. "Exit the structure." Then, a new voice, unamplified, but carrying with the kind of authority no PA system can counterfeit. "This is State Fire Marshal's office. Sheriff Latham, you will stand by." Marin and Harlan looked at each other. The beacon had found the ears it needed. A beat. 2. The kind of silence that testifies by existing. On whose authority? Latham's voice, losing its smile like a man misplacing his hat. On the authority of the Attorney General. On the authority of 2 sealed investigations tied to the co-op's insurance claims. On the authority of the past catching up, the voice replied, not interested in winning a contest of volume. Harlan exhaled a breath Marin hadn't known he'd been saving since the day he disappeared. He put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, wait, warmth, permission, and then let it fall, because fathers have to get good at not overusing their hands. "Now we can go back in," he said. "While everyone above us remembers how to behave." They slid from the ditch to the foundation's shadow and across the yard, keeping to the holes in the scene where men forget to point their lights. The barn's side door, the one that stuck on humid days, gave like an old friend who tells you no twice to feel better when he says yes. Inside, night was lit by broken lightning and the sideways gold of truck lamps. Men moved in a choreography that looked like law and smelled like panic. The aisle was clogged, the feed room was shadow. Harlan tugged Marin toward the tool wall gap. She went first, bending at the waist, binders against her chest, gun muzzle down. He followed with the case and a coil of cokes he had acquired at some point she didn't have time to admire him for. They wriggled into the corridor. It poured them back into the room beneath the barn. The door was open a hand's width. Nor stood in the middle of the space as if it were a courtroom and she had chosen it for its acoustics. The cabinet sang its steady little broadcast to the county, the state, and anyone else with an antenna and a need for a live lecture on cause and effect. And so, Noor was saying when they came in, when the dryer failed, the payout went to Pruitt's company, which subcontracted to Evans' crew, which hired Latham's cousin to consult on recovery. The men who burned survived long enough to be called heroes. The man who reported the siphon disappeared. She looked at Harlan without looking like she needed to. Until he didn't. The shaft echoed with a new set of footsteps. Not Latham's hesitant righteous anger or the deputy's thin bravado. Measured. Calm. Men who had been trained not to make the place nervous just by entering. A figure filled the gap. A badge, not the county's star and not the highway patrol's shield. The state. Rain dripped from his hat brim in an even line because rain respects some hats. "Miss Quell," he said, eyes moving over Noor, Harlan, Mirren, the cabinet, the cylinder like a man listing evidence out loud in the order it will appear in an affidavit. "Ms. Noor Rahmani?" He pronounced it right. Noor lifted her chin a fraction. "Mr. Kincaid." He nodded as if greeting a neighbor and a fugitive and a man who builds good fences, all at once. "I'm Deputy Fire Marshal Kepler." Latham pushed into the shaft under the state man's arm, crowding, insisting on being present in rooms where he might soon be asked to be absent. The deputy came after him, wide-eyed, less sure now that he'd seen uniform hierarchy behave like a food chain. "Turn that off," Latham barked at the cabinet. Kepler didn't look at him. "Leave it," he said to Mirren. "For the record." He pivoted to Noor. "Ma'am, are you prepared to give a statement?" "I've been giving one for a year," Noor said dryly. "I would be delighted to give it to someone who writes it down." Mirren watched the sheriff watch the room decide what it believed. She watched a muscle in his jaw explore new territory. She watched her own hands be steady over the red lever. "Sheriff," Kepler said at last without looking at him, "you will remove yourself from the immediate area. Your presence raises questions we will answer elsewhere." "I'm the sheriff," Latham said. "This is my county." "It is," Kepler agreed. "And this is an arson investigation that got tired of waiting for your permission." He stepped aside just enough to let two more state jackets down the ladder. "Deputy Qualls will escort you upstairs." The deputy hesitated, caught between his bad boss and the new gravity. Latham glared. The deputy looked at Mirren as if to ask a question he'd never been told he was allowed to ask. "Go," Noor said softly to him. "Before this becomes about you too." He went. Latham lingered one beat too long, then turned and clanged up, each rung a resentment. Kepler took in the cylinder. "What's in there?" "Air that's been cleaned and counted," Noor said. "And the reason I'm alive to talk to you." "And what's out there?" he asked, nodding roughly in the direction of the barn above. "Men who think loud is the same as lawful," Harlan said. "And a county deciding where it stands." Kepler nodded once. "Good," he said. "Let's add context." He reached into his jacket and took out a small woven pouch, extracted a thumb drive, and held it up. "For your files," he told Mirren, as if she had always had files the state would care to borrow. "Depositions from a case we've been forced to keep quiet. Names. Timelines. The kind of detail that, when combined with what you have, becomes difficult to dismiss as rumor." "Why now?" Mirren asked. "Because timing matters and motives collect interest." "Because your beacon went off," Kepler said. "And because the storm brought down 2 old poles on County 8, and I'm not above letting weather help with a warrant." His expression didn't move, but Mirren felt something like satisfaction under it, the slow kind that accrues to people who waited a decade for a chance to be useful. The cabinet's meter ticked along. The room breathed. Above them, the barn's noise changed from invasion to management. Kepler lifted his radio. "Qualls," he said. "Secure the structure. No one in or out without a warrant or a reason that will hold up when my boss asks me to say it out loud." He clipped the radio back. "Ms. Rahmani, if you please." Noor squared her shoulders in a way that wasn't about squaring shoulders at all. It was about letting a room know that this, too, was part of her job. She started at the beginning, at the dryer that didn't fail so much as it was told to, at the calls she'd made, at the night the men with boots and clipboards arrived before the fire had cooled. Harlan sat on the edge of the cot and rolled his shoulders once as if putting down a weight he'd been carrying under his shirt for 15 years. Marin stayed at the lever and let the words wrap around the room and clospen themselves to the county. She watched Kepler make notes that were not for show. She watched Nor unspool a story so patiently that every knot revealed not just a culprit but the system that knitted culprits together. When Nor finished, the room held quiet for a beat as if someone had just prayed and the building wanted to give the prayer 2 seconds to land. Kepler nodded, slow and certain. "All right," he said. "Next." He looked at Harlan. "You left to keep her alive?" "I left," Harlan said, "because the man who said he'd lose the paperwork if I stayed made it plain that staying would make my daughter a footnote." He looked at Marin. "And because I taught her to use tools. I forgot to teach her how to be invisible." "No," Marin said wearily. "You taught me to be visible to the right people. And not to apologize for it." She felt the 2 sentences rearrange themselves into the life she might have if she survived this week. Upstairs, the trucks idled into patience. The loud hailer fell silent. The storm settled into the kind of steady rain farmers call honest. In the distance, sirens that were not the county's moved along the highway and then turned down the lane as if they had always known where to go and had simply been waiting for a reason. Kepler stood. "We're going to do 3 things now," he said. "We're going to secure this room. We're going to copy these files. And we're going to walk out of here in a way that makes future arguments boring." Marin let go of the lever. The cabinet continued broadcasting on a loop, Nor's words cued to repeat at intervals, Harlan's voice threaded through in places to add dates and spell the names people never spell the same way when they don't want to be found. They packed binders into evidence boxes, SIM cards into anti-static sleeves, the Polaroid into a clear bag that made it look more official and less true. When they climbed the ladder, the barn looked like a scene that had decided to be dignified about its scars. State jackets stood with county badges, when forced to be near other badges, remembered how to behave. Latham stood off to one side under the lip of the roof, trying to figure out if the rain had done him a favor or a disservice by showing up when it did. The deputy watched him the way young men watch men they thought they might become and are glad they won't. Kepler's people fanned to the house into the old office closet where Harlan had left his first layer of careful. They acted like men and women who expected to be believed later. "Sheriff," Kepler said, as if addressing a neighbor about a fence line, "will need access to county records from the dates Ms. Romani outlined." "This isn't your," Latham started and then stopped, because beginning a sentence with a denial is a poor tactic when you have nowhere to take the verb. "It is now," Kepler said pleasantly. "Ms. Quell, I'd like you at the office downtown in the morning to give your statement and to sign a receipt for your property on loan. Mr. Kincaid, we'll discuss your absence." He let the legal ellipses do their own work. Harlan nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, and in a single word Marin heard the fatigued elation of a man promised a night in a bed instead of on a cot near a pump. "Now," Kepler added, "I suggest we all go inside, make some coffee, and practice our small talk like civilized people while my team does their job." They did. The farmhouse kitchen, paint peeled, clock stubborn, table scarred, became a war room powered by drip coffee and notebooks. The storm lashed the windows and then turned, as storms will, from threat to background. Nor sat with her back to the wall where the duct rattled in a way that would bother her once she was allowed to be bothered by normal things again. Harlan stood at the sink and ran water over his hands and then stood there a while, looking at the water as if it might have a better idea than his had so far. Marin made mugs from the mismatched set her grandmother had gathered from county fair raffles. She poured for Kepler first without quite meaning to. He took it like a man who understood small fealties because he'd practiced them. "You did right," he told her under the noise of state and county in the other room. "Not because it's easy to turn on a microphone. Because it's hard." "I still don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. He smiled in a way that made the rain on the window feel like punctuation. That's when people are least dangerous to the wrong things, he said. Keep it that way as long as you can. The county's ambulance took Marshal Bob McAllister to Doc Green's office, then to the hospital 2 towns over, where men with degrees would marvel at the way men without them had kept each other alive. The state troopers took Noor's statement on paper and on a body cam in case anyone needed to be reminded that truth looks like truth from more than one angle. Kepler took custody of the binders with a possession that looked less like seizure and more like stewardship. Latham left with a promise to return and a face that had learned how to subtract votes in real time. By evening, the storm had run out of nouns and was down to adjectives. The trucks departed in a conga line of exhausted authority. The yard became a yard again. Marin and Harlan stood on the porch and watched the county go home. Noor leaned against the door jamb and let the air from the kitchen make her hair smell like someone else's dinner. You still have the Packard, Noor said to Harlan with a small sideways smile. I still have the idea of it, he said. Which is what I had when I started. Figured it would make a good decoy. Everything becomes a decoy eventually, Noor said, a sentiment so simple it felt like a proverb. They slept in the house because sometimes the bravest thing a body can do is lie down in the place where it once learned to be afraid. Marin slept in her old room. The ceiling still had the places where water had taught it a map. She listened for the barn and heard it, a contented, exhausted settling like a parent after company leaves. In the morning, the world had decided to look scrubbed. The fields forgave the storm for being dramatic and went back to their bargaining with the sun. Marin made eggs and burned the first batch and found, in the bottom of a drawer, the old salt cellar her father had used with a superstition he never explained. They drove into town in a convoy of state, county, and one Packard under a tarp on a trailer. The developer's glossy brochures in the realtor's window looked suddenly like artifacts from a brief era when men mistook certainty for destiny. Kepler took statements. Noor signed forms. Harlan sat through a polite scolding about disappearing and a more serious talk about how to reappear without making the whole machine look foolish. Marin signed receipts for her father's files. When Kepler handed her a copy of the drive he'd given her, a second copy, an insurance policy against an insurance policy, she felt the weight of it and refused the urge to tuck it into her boot. What now? She asked him when the pens had all been capped and the assistant had brought bad cookies on a paper plate and the printer had clicked off in that little way that says it will be sullen if asked to do more today. Now, process, Kepler said. And paperwork. And speeches. And a certain amount of swallowing from people who don't like the taste of humility. He slipped the pen into his breast pocket. And you figure out if you want to sell a farm or run one. She looked out the window at the courthouse square where the bronze soldier always looked like he wanted to hand his rifle to a passing boy and go have coffee instead. He told me not to call you, she said, more to herself than to Kepler. He told me to follow the sound. You did, Kepler said. And it brought you here. That's how sound works when it's used right. He nodded toward the door where Harlan and Noor were laughing softly at something the receptionist had said about her cat. Make sure you let yourselves be ordinary for a while. It's the only way to stay extraordinary when it counts. They went home by the road that kisses the creek twice. The Packard, under its tarp, looked like a whale humbly participating in a parade for gulls. In the yard, the cottonwoods wrote, longhand, beautifully, about the business of being trees. In the barn, Marin stood in the keep stall and touched the platform latch and left it alone. She walked to the cylinder and put her palm on the glass that was now only glass. Noor stood beside her, healthy in a way a person looks when their body has been loved by science and their future has been told to sit and stay. What do you do now? Marin asked her. Testify, Noor said. Then pick a town where I can be an uninteresting woman with interesting books. Maybe come back when the trials are over and sit on that hay bale and watch the light behave. Marin nodded. What do I do now? She asked, though she already knew. You do what you've always done, Noor said. You fix what's under your hands until it runs. And you decide where you want your hands to be. Harlan came in wiping his palms on a rag out of habit. That storm chewed up the ridge on the west pasture, he said, and when Marin looked at him sideways for bringing small weather into a room that had held big weather, he shrugged. Somebody's got to fix the fence. She laughed then, a sound the barn took in and put somewhere it could find again later. We fix fences, she said. And cars. Start with coffee, Harlan said, and walked back toward the house like he had always meant to be a man who said start with coffee. They spent the afternoon doing useful things without trying to make them symbolic. Marin sorted bolts by thread and length. Harlan checked the pressure in the Packard's tires purely for the joy of pretending it might matter today. Nor sat with the ledgers and made a list on a yellow pad in her neat print, names to call, court dates to expect, things to return that had been borrowed for too long by men who assumed no one would ask. In the evening, a pickup pulled into the lane. It was the developer, the same man who had stood in the Miller barn and called Patience junk. He walked up the porch steps and tried on a smile. I suppose the sale is off, he said, attempting rueful like a man who'd read about it but never met it. Marin considered the word sale and found it still relevant. It's paused, she said. I have to think. She let him stand there long enough to wonder if thinking was contagious. But if we talk again, it'll be with a lawyer who doesn't golf with your boss. He nodded, something like respect sneaking through his caution. Fair enough, he said. He took off his cap and put it back on because some men have to do something with their hands when they discover the terms have changed. After he left, Harlan leaned on the porch rail and said, You could sell a sliver for a conservation easement. Keep the rest. Maybe, Marin said. Maybe I keep all of it. Maybe I keep none. But if I sell, it'll be because I choose to, not because fear did it for me. She looked at him. If you stay. If, he asked, smiling finally in a way that made the years do something graceful. You're painting the kitchen, she said. He laughed with his whole face. Deal. Night came in soft. The county settled. The radio upstairs clicked once in the way machines do when they like being left on. The cylinder below hummed without hunger for the first time since it was installed. The Packard looked at itself in the reflection of a window and decided, magnanimously, not to be vain. On the porch, Nor watched fireflies decide where to be. You know, she said to Marin, when your father made me that promise, that he'd keep me alive long enough to make my words expensive, he said something I wrote down and kept in my wallet for a while. What? Marin asked. He said, you build the truth into something with a roof, and then you stand under it when it rains. Nor smiled. You did that today. I had help, Marin said. She reached into her pocket and touched the key. It had warmed to her. Or she had warmed to it. The difference mattered less than it had yesterday. Keep it, Harlan said from the doorway, as if he'd read her hand. The barn listens to you. The days that followed were noisy. Reporters called. Some got through. The paper ran Nor's story above the fold and spelled her name right. The county commissioners scheduled a special session and spent the first 20 minutes trying to remember how to call a recess without looking like children. Kepler sent an email with a subject line that was not dramatic in content that was, indictments, warrants, subpoenas. Words that had once been heavy in Marin's mouth became tools she could set on a shelf and dust. In all that, they still fixed fences. They still drank coffee in a kitchen that had made a treaty with peeling paint. They still lowered the platform under the keep stall, not to hide but to inventory what a future deserved to know. They replaced the transmitter's battery and wrote the date on gaffer's tape because nothing is more tragic than a dead battery in a working plan. On a Wednesday that smelled like peaches and rain remembered, a letter arrived with the Attorney General's seal, thanking Nor for her courage, praising Harlan's prudence, and asking Marin for permission to copy the files once more. Marin put the letter on the fridge with a magnet that had once held a recipe for rhubarb bars and now held a bookmark for a story that would have to be told enough times to become boring. And on a Saturday when the county gathered for the farmers' market like it always had even when there were no farmers left in attendance, Marin drove the Packard to town. Harlan had stayed up nights in the last week finishing what he'd started. Nor had stood beside him and held the light the way a person does when she relishes the humble act of assisting in a resurrection. Marin had offered to sand and was demoted to polishing, which felt like a promotion because the car's skin turned the rag into satisfaction. She drove slow, not because the Packard demanded it but because you do not hurry the good parts. People looked up, and some pointed, and some cried without meaning to because memory had snuck up on them and asked to be fed. At the square, she parked in front of the hardware store. The owner, whose father had counted screws into her palm once when she was a child and told her to bring the extras back and she had, wiped his eyes and then blamed dust that didn't exist. Kepler was there in jeans and a shirt that made him look like a man who had always been a man instead of a badge. He tipped an imaginary hat. "You run it," he said, "or does it run you?" "Both," Marin said. "Like a county." Nor chewed a peach sample and made an approving noise people reserve for absolutions and dessert. "This is the part," she said, "where we let the world be ordinary again." "And then?" Marin asked. "And then, when the next storm comes, we already know which lever to pull," Nor said. They stood there until the peach juice made their fingers glow and until the bell in the courthouse clock tower told them it was time to go get on with living. At dusk, back at the barn, the radio on the workbench crackled once. Not a broadcast. A call. Familiar. A voice that now lived partly in the county's good opinion and partly in the room under the barn. "Marin?" She pressed the transmit, and her thumb knew the force and the angle the way a body remembers a lover and a tractor both. "I hear you," she said. "Just checking," Kepler said from the other end of that ordinary miracle. "To make sure your beacon's still on." "It is," she said, looking around at the rafters and the joists and the cylinder that was only a thing now and not a verb. "Even when it isn't." The Packard ticked as it cooled. A breeze moved through the aisle making the tools on their pegs think about ringing and then reconsider in favor of quiet. Nor hummed a song Marin didn't know and decided to learn. Harlan sat on the tailgate and watched the yard adopt evening like a new cat. "We could name the car," he suggested. "We could not," Marin said. "Fine," he conceded. "We could pretend not to and call it something under our breath." She grinned at him. "We could call it Not Yet." He laughed. "Fitting." Marin turned off the radio and then turned it on again, because some rituals are about showing yourself you remember how. She slid the bolt on the barn door and listened to its seat with a sound that meant held. She locked nothing that didn't need locking. She left everything else to the honest care of night. On the porch, they sat with their feet on the rail and watched the lightning far off on the horizon practice for a performance that might or might not arrive. It was beautiful. It was distant. It was theirs to notice without fear. Marin leaned her head on her father's shoulder the way she had when 10 and the fair's fireworks had made her heart run. She felt him lean his cheek against her hair without asking if he was allowed. The barn breathed. The county slept. The truth had a roof. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.